Have you ever heard the saying, "It's in my blood"? Well, it is. I come from a long line of serial killers. Technically, my grandfather, Pedro, was a mass murderer. His reign of terror claimed 298 victims somewhere in the Andes. It was near the end of his run he impregnated a prostitute who would give birth to my father after fleeing to America. My father, Felix, was a truck driver, but in his spare time he would kidnap and murder women and young girls. During his active years he was given a lot of names: the I-70 Killer, the Freeway Phantom, and the Parkway Stalker, just to name a few. He and my mother were killed by a drunk driver in 1990, and I was turned over to Child Protective Services. Despite the circumstances, I had a fairly happy childhood. I was adopted quickly by Oliver and Gail Campbell. They were good people. Oliver was a professor at the local college, and Gail was an artist. They gave me a great life. They never harmed me in any way and did their best to keep me safe, but no matter how hard they tried, they couldn't protect me from myself. I suppose by now you're wondering who I am. Well, boys and girls, that's my little secret. For now, you may call me Dante. There's a lot to unpack here, so I guess I'll just start at the beginning. My first kill, well, human kill anyways, was a kid named Billy McCarthy. He was what you would consider one of the popular kids, if there is such a thing, in 5th grade. I guess here's where you would get the stereotypical popular bully routine, but no, that's not how this story goes. I wasn't picked on or pushed around. Hell, for the most part, people barely noticed I was around, man. Before you go jump to conclusions, that has nothing to do with it either. The why isn't as interesting as the how, but I'll tell you anyway. I picked him because I didn't like his shoes. I know, it's petty as hell, but for 10-year-old me, that was enough. I watched him for a few days. I didn't have a clue back then. I had no idea what I was doing or how I was going to do it. I just knew I wanted it done. It was a Friday afternoon. Billy and his friends walked through Stone Park every day, but on Fridays he had soccer practice and would be late, so he would be by himself. I told my mother I was going to the park about an hour before I knew he would be there. On the way, I stopped by Old Man Hudson's place and broke into the tool shed behind his house. There wasn't much to pick from, and being so young, I chose the only thing I could fit into my pocket: a flathead screwdriver. When I got to the park, I spent a little too long looking for the perfect spot, and by the time I found one, it was too late. I spotted Billy already on the far end of the park. I'd already missed my chance. I know, that's a little anticlimactic, but it turned out to be for the best. That night, I was up late watching an old movie. I can't recall the name of it, but in it there was a man who poisoned his wife by crushing up pills and mixing it into her food. This gave me an idea. Now, being 10, I didn't have access to pills and wouldn't have known what to use even if I did. What I did have was my father's workshop in the garage. There were lots of chemicals. I couldn't tell you what half of them were, but there were quite a few of them that had warnings on. I poured a little from each one into a water bottle and saved it until I went back to school. That Monday, while in the gym, I asked to use the restroom. While I was gone, I went to Billy's locker and pulled his thermos out of his backpack, and I poured about a cup or so of the sweet-smelling juice out, and then replaced it with the cocktail I mixed up. When I was done, I sniffed it, just to see if I could detect it, and much to my surprise, there was only a slight difference. Later that day, When we went to lunch, I sat at my usual table and pretended to not know what was about to happen. After about 15 minutes, people started screaming. There was a sudden panic and the cafeteria exploded into chaos. Billy was violently seizing on the floor, spewing bloody foam from his mouth as teachers rushed to his aid. He died later that night in the hospital. It was all over the news. When they found he'd been poisoned, everyone was looking for someone to blame. There were all sorts of rumors on who it could have been, and kids being kids made up stories that grew into urban legends. The case went unsolved, but I was hooked. I spent the rest of that school year riding the high till the buzz started to fade away, and by the start of the next year, no one was talking about it anymore. I tried to go without it. I really did, but every day I walked into the halls then didn't feel the fear in the air. I felt sick. I wanted it back. I needed to feel that power again, but if there was one thing I learned, it was to not rush the process. If one death fed me for a year, then 2 would get me into 8th grade. Looking back, I have to laugh at my reasoning. It was all so silly now that I had to reflect on those moments. Nevertheless, I spent my first semester picking out targets. Luckily for me, there was no shortage of people I didn't like, but one in particular, Coach Phillips. He gave me the best reason of all. Mr. Phillips was the head coach of the football team. He was a large, muscular man with a head full of gray hair. Everyone loved Coach Phillips. When parents and staff were around, he put on an act that made them believe that he was a genuine good guy. But when it was just him and the team, he was a brutal dictator with a foul mouth and a quick temper. I heard the stories, but because I wasn't on the team, I'd never seen it for myself. One afternoon, I had to stay after school for detention. I wasn't a troublemaker or anything like that. I just got caught talking to my friend Caleb, and the teacher punished me for it. When detention was finally over, I was walking through the building near the gym and stopped to tie my shoe. While I was kneeling, I started hearing someone arguing and got a little nosy. I crept into the locker room, following the voices till I got to this area everyone called the cage. It was where the football team's lockers were, and no one besides them were allowed inside. Once I passed the cage, I came to the hall that led to the coach's office. That's where the yelling was coming from. As quietly as I could, I crept down the hall and got as close as possible without being seen. From where I was, I could see part of his office through the window, but couldn't see everything. The coach barked out, "Are you fucking stupid, Denton? I told you, get your shit together or there would be consequences." I caught a glimpse of one of the older kids standing near the door as the coach stormed over and grabbed him by the arm, pulling him into the office before closing the door. Now, all I could see was the coach's back and hear him yelling, but for only a moment before the sound of him slapping whoever that Denton kid was. There was a crash from the kid slamming into the desk, then a struggle that only lasted a few seconds. The hall went quiet. I waited for a moment before I started to get out of there, then I heard muffled screams and whimpering. I had to know what was happening. I slowly crept around the corner and made my way over to the window. When I peeped inside, I nearly threw up. The coach had that boy bent over his desk, violating him in the worst way imaginable. I never saw the kid's face. I turned tail and got out of there as fast as possible. I ran all the way home. I thought about telling my parents or maybe the police, but something stopped me. I knew at that moment it had to be me. It was up to me to stop this. I don't want you to get the wrong idea. I didn't want to stop him out of some need to be the hero. I wanted to stop him because he was on my turf, and even then I didn't like sharing. It would take me a while to come up with a plan for the coach, but in the meantime, I had my sights set out on one Elzia Stewart. She was a grade above me. I couldn't really tell you why I sniffed her out. She wasn't popular or even a standout student of all intent and purposes. She was just another face in the crowd, but for some reason, that made her perfect. Finding her pattern wasn't easy. I only really saw her once or twice a day during school, so there's no way I could get to her bag. I needed another approach. I watched her for days. Eventually I found out she rode the bus and what side of town she lived on, but none of that was any help. I was getting close to giving up on her. Then on Tuesday afternoon, there was a fire. Faulty wiring lit the installation inside the walls, and before anyone knew what was going on, a large section of the building was on fire. The alarms blared while all the halls filled with smoke, and all that organized fire drill shit flew straight out the window. Students and teachers alike flooded the halls and headed for the exit, and in that chaos, I spotted her. She was standing near the janitor's closet, talking with another girl. By the time I got close, the other girl was walking away. Keeping my back to Elzia, I moved in with the crowd till I was standing directly in front of her, then pretended to get thrown off balance, stumbling into her, causing her to fall, landing just inside the doorway. Without looking back, I slammed the door shut and locked it, still facing the surging crowd. No one noticed. I joined the crowd and filed out to the courtyard where we all gathered, watching the school burn. I stared at that door until they moved us away, and she never came out. Her body was discovered later that day, and once again that feeling of power surged through me, but as good as it felt, it wasn't enough. I needed more. No one panicked. There was just no fear. Just sadness. It felt like a hollow victory. They wrote it off as a tragic accident, so there was no muttering or wondering. No fantastic stories or boogeyman bumping off the town folks. It was utterly disappointing. The rest of that year was a wash, but the next year, when things got back to normal, I'd already made up my mind. Coach was first on the list. I'd hit a little growth spurt, put on some weight, so I tried out for the team and made it. I hated every second of it. There are some benefits like discipline, strength, stamina, and speed, but seeing his face, knowing what he did, what he was, made me sick. We had lost 2 of our last 3 games, and Coach was not happy. I knew sooner or later he would start taking it out on the players, and I was right. The Monday after our loss, he started having one-on-one player meetings in his office. I can't say he did what he did to all the players. I don't know that as a fact, but I do know there were a couple I'd seen him being tough on, and I'm almost certain they were victims. I made sure I skipped my meeting and dodged him all day till after school. Over the summer, I found a knife in an old trunk of my father's. It wasn't that big, but it was heavy and sharp. I made sure of that. There's an unmarked pet grave filled with fur to prove it. In any case, once I was sure no one was around, I went to Coach Phillips' office and knocked on the door. His office smelled like a combination of foot fungus spray and Old Spice cologne. He grimaced at me when he opened the door. "Well, it's about damn time you decided to show up. You think I have all day to wait on your sorry ass? Get in here and close my damn door." My heart was pounding so hard I could barely hear him scolding me for wasting time. He slammed his ham-sized fist on the desk and jolted towards me, asking if I was listening. I wasn't. The second he grabbed my shirt, I pulled my blade and plunged it into his neck, spraying my face with blood. Coach's eyes went wide. He gasped and gurgled, releasing his grip, thrashing back away from me, swinging wildly. Grasping at the gushing hole in his throat, he staggered back and stumbled over to the chair, crashed to the ground, wheezing. I hadn't realized the knife was still in my hand until he started reaching for me. I swung that blade as hard as I could at his outreaching hand, slicing off one of his fingers, but he kept coming. Sleeping in his own blood, he crawled towards me. I maneuvered around his office to stay out of reach, but he was a big man. I couldn't dodge forever. Getting up off the floor and grabbing me by the throat, he snatched me off my feet and hoisted me into the air. I struggled against his grip, thinking I was going to die, till I jabbed that knife into his eye and felt the blade scrape bone. He let out a groan and dropped me, then staggered back over to his desk, mumbling something I couldn't make out before taking a seat in his chair. Tilting his head back and resting his hands on his knees, he let out one last gurgling breath and went still. Time stopped. It felt like electricity was running through my veins. Instinct took over, and the next thing I know, I'm pulling the knife free from the coach's eye socket. Everything seemed out of step, like the frames of reality were lagging by a second, causing the world around me to have a distorted glare. I moved through the hall quickly to the locker room and got in the shower, clothes and all. I stood there, watching the hot water washing away the blood. When I was done, I changed into my gym clothes, stole a pair of shoes out of the cage. Once I was all cleaned up, I put on my clothes in a trash bag, and then took the towels and cleaned the hallway and went home. I ate dinner, I played video games, watched television till it was time for bed, and I slept like a baby. The next morning, when I got to school, police were everywhere. The crowd was buzzing. The word was out. Everyone was talking about it. I could feel the energy vibrating through everyone around me. It was intoxicating. I was too young to understand what I was feeling. My mind couldn't process the overpowering emotions that were pulsing through me. So I did the only thing I could think of to calm myself. I hummed Old MacDonald underneath my breath, and for some reason it worked. I made it through the day, listening to all the different versions of what everyone thought happened, and managed not to burst out laughing. As weeks went by and no one was being arrested for the murder, the legend grew. Rumors started to go around about some shady drifter that wandered into the town and was hiding, waiting to pick us off one by one. It was hilarious. I even heard it was the mob and Coach Phillips was in witness protection or some nonsense, but the best one and my personal favorite was the one of the school staff was a killer. It created this weird vibe that had all of the students edge. I loved every second of it. By Christmas break, the rumors had become full ghost stories, but the buzz was calming down. It was time for more. Since I wouldn't be back in school for a week, I started looking around the neighborhood for anyone that caught my eye, but the first few days there was nothing. For time's sake, I'll gloss over the next couple years, mainly because I didn't kill anyone else until high school. Well, there was this homeless guy, but I don't count that one because it was an accident. By the time I was in high school, I'd become what you would call the quiet kid, but it was by design. I'd come up with a plan. I wanted to see if I could control someone else and get them to do my dirty work without them knowing it. First, I had to pick my subjects. They weren't hard to find. The first was a boy named Dennis. He was lanky and tall with pale skin and bright red hair. In a way, you could say he made himself stick out, but no one deserves to be pushed around for being different. Dennis had a best friend that he hung out with named Chris. They dressed alike and listened to the same music, so naturally the two became targets together. Freshman year for them was hell. They were chased home, beaten up, constantly the subject of random rumors. I watched them long enough to learn some of their likes and dislikes, and one thing they both had in common was some band called LZ. It took me a month to get a concert shirt, but the day I wore it to school I met Chris. He was blown away by the shirt. Holy shit, how'd you get that? His eyes were so wide I thought they might pop out of his head. You have to let me buy that shirt off you. I'll give you $50 for it right now. I made up some story about getting it from one of the band members and it wasn't for sale, but from that day on, we started to become friends. It wasn't long before he introduced me to Dennis, and from there we hung out every day. One afternoon, we were supposed to meet up at his little hideout they'd been using for years. It wasn't much to look at. It was a clearing deep in the woods where they would get high and shoot their father's guns when they could sneak them out of the house. I got there early that day so I could wait for them. When they made it, they were both clearly hurt. Dennis had a swollen eye and a busted lip. Chris had a bloody nose and his shirt was torn. They ranted and raved about being tired of all of it and how they were going to take off. They wanted to drop out and run away. I convinced them that was the wrong move. Running doesn't change who you are. It just changes where you're at. Stand up for yourselves. Force them to change how they treat you. Wiping blood from his chin, Dennis snapped. Don't you think we've tried? That just makes it worse. Look at my fucking face. Do you think I stood there and let this happen? Do you think Chris wanted to get the shit kicked out of him by some asshole who decided today was a good day to pick on somebody? Come on, man. We shouldn't live like this. I had to choose my next words very carefully. I didn't want to push the envelope too fast. I get it. I know you fight back. What I'm saying is, maybe you're fighting back the wrong way. What we need is a way to level things out. You know, make it a fair fight. Once the wheels were turning, there was no stopping the machine. They quickly grabbed hold to the idea and ran with it. At first it was sticks and bats, then knives, finally landing on guns. By the end of that day, they were just talking about it, imagining scenarios and cracking jokes. By the end of the month, after several more incidents, we were actually making plans. We set up P.O. boxes and ordered weapons using false information we got from different places. Before long, we were practicing every day after school for weeks. We never wrote anything down and never told a soul what we were planning. The idea was simple. We would wipe them all out and show the world what happens when you push someone too far. In order for my plan to work, I couldn't be involved. This part was actually a lot easier than you may think. My father had already planned on having me miss school for a trip to Texas, so all I had to do was time it out, and it worked out to perfection. The day before we were supposed to do it, I had to break it to them that my dad sprung a trip on me and I would have to miss it. We argued a little bit, but in the end, they vowed to go through with the plan. What happened next would become one of the worst mass shootings in history. I got a bad feeling from it. I didn't like the attention. It was too much, and it ended badly for both of them. I never attempted that one again. The idea was better than the reality. In the end, it was a lesson learned. I didn't do anything for years after that. The whole experience was upsetting for me. I went on with my life and made it through college without a single incident. For the most part, I just written it off as just a really fucked up phase in my life. Then I started working for a company that will remain nameless because mistakes like that get you caught. I was invited to a New Year's Eve party one day after work, and since I didn't really have any plans, I went. The party was amazing. Great food, great music, and nice people. For the most part. I had just finished my first beer when I ran into an old friend of mine, Caleb. We laughed and talked about the old days for a moment, then we went our separate ways. It was good to see him again. But as the night progressed, I started catching him in different spots watching me. I brushed it off the first few times, but as we got closer and closer to midnight, I would find him closer to me. Feeling uncomfortable, I wound up leaving early. Walking through the parking lot, Caleb called up to me. "I've been looking for you a long time now. Do you want to hear something funny?" I thought you would at least thank me for cleaning up your messes, but no. Instead, you ignored me and left me behind. Why? Before I could process what he was saying, he launched forward, clubbing me across the head with something heavy, and everything went black. When I woke up, I was in the back seat of my car, parked under an overpass near the river. There was a yellow sticky note attached to the steering wheel that said, "Call me," with a phone number written in blue ink. I ignored it, got myself together, and went home. Everything went back to normal for a couple of days till I started noticing a bad odor in my car. After a quick search, I found a badly butchered young woman's body wrapped in plastic, rotting in my trunk. I hadn't had to deal with anything like this before. I'd never given any thought to getting rid of bodies. I wound up driving as far away as I could and dumping her in a bog. The body was never recovered as far as I know. The next morning before I could leave work, I got a phone call. "It's your turn. Let's see how you like it." Before I could yell my response into the receiver, the line went dead. Hanging it up out of anger, I grabbed my keys and stormed out the front door. I don't even remember if I locked it. I was in my car, just heading for work in a daze. I couldn't get his words out of my head. When I got there, I spent most of the day just going through the motions, but right around lunch, I caught the sight of Caleb watching me from across the office. How the hell did he know where I worked? I got up from my desk and quickly headed for his direction. I never took my eyes off of him. But somehow, between me getting up from my desk and walking to where he was standing, he'd vanished. I don't scare easily, but something about this was getting under my skin. I couldn't remember where or when I'd met Caleb. As far back as I could think, he'd always been around. I had to put him out of my mind and get back to work, but for the rest of the day, odd things kept happening. I was sitting at my desk when Tracy, one of the office managers, stopped to talk to me. I'll have you know, I've won several awards for my innovations with this company, and I don't appreciate you saying I contribute nothing to this project. I was in shock by her tone. She seemed genuinely upset, but I had no idea what she was talking about. For you to call my work into question in front of a regional lead was inexcusable. I should fire you. I was completely caught off guard. I didn't know how to respond to something I had no memory of doing. Before I could come up with a response, she was called away. Random people passed by my desk for the rest of the day smiling and giving me thumbs up. Everyone hated Tracy. She was a self-absorbed blowhard that took credit for other people's work and never once defended the people under her. As happy as it made me to see her squirm, I was still left with this horrible sinking feeling and a gap in my memory. The more I thought about it, I couldn't remember leaving for lunch. I could clearly recall seeing 11:45 on the clock and thinking I'd only had 15 minutes left. The very next thing I remembered was seeing Caleb and getting up from my desk. By the time my workday was over, I'd had at least 4 conversations with 4 different people I had no memory of meeting, and the truly disturbing part was they all seemed to know me really well. I couldn't wrap my mind around it. When I made it home that evening, there was a note taped to my front door. It read, "There is no darkness without light, no wrong without right." It was nonsense. Just more scare tactics Caleb was using to get under my skin. Tossing the note in the garbage, I went inside and got some rest. If he wanted the old me, he would get it. I started making plans for the next time I saw him. The idea was simple. The next time we were face to face, I was planning on ending his pathetic life. I began carrying a few of my favorite new toys, like an overpowered taser and zip ties. It wasn't long before I would get my chance. The following week, I used my vacation time to take off from work for a while and set my plan in motion. I jog every morning along the same route. There was a long stretch of paths that cut through the woods. If he was going to ambush me, that would be the perfect spot. At 5:30 a.m., I was just hitting the trail. I could feel him out there somewhere watching, waiting on this moment. I'd been on the trail for 10 minutes when he sprung his trap. I spotted the trip line of a mile away, but I played along just for fun. When I snagged the line, I slammed it in the ground and pretended to be hurt. Caleb predictably rushed in, and as I rode to my back, pulled out the taser, fired, hitting him square in the chest. The second he dropped, I got up and hogtied him before dragging him off the path. When I was sure we were out of sight, I checked him for weapons and found he was carrying a combat knife. He smiled at me while I was holding it in my hand. Feels good, doesn't it? But before he could say another word, I clamped my left hand over his mouth and used my right to drive the blade deep through his throat. Turning my wrist to open the hole, I stared into his eyes, and as he wheezed out a long breath, I inhaled deeply, sucking in his last gasp of life. Once I was sure it was over, I pulled my hand from his face. He was smiling. I had moved fast. The other people jogged that path, and someone could be coming at any moment. I took off my sweatshirt, rolled the knife up in it, and stuffed it in the sport bag I was carrying my water in. Using the water, I washed my hands and face before getting back on the path just in time to see a pair of women turning onto the trail. I had to get rid of the trip line. I pretended to be stretching, then took a step towards the tree and acted like I was tying my shoe. In one motion, I slipped my fingers through the loop and snatched back, snapping the line and slightly cutting into my fingers at the same time. I stood and stretched one last time before jogging past them and heading back to my apartment. That old feeling washed over me, as I moved along the sidewalk, and I realized in that moment how much I'd missed it. The electricity in my veins, the fire in my lungs, the outright blissful euphoria of it all surged through me, and I smiled. I laughed and picked up my pace, feeling more energized than I had in years. I was back. That night, I went out bar hopping. I'm not a heavy drinker, but that wasn't the point. I was fishing. I wasn't getting anything for the first couple hours. I moved from place to place, waiting for someone to catch my eye, but for the most part, it was a dud. I called for a cab and stepped outside to wait. "Excuse me, can I get a lot?" A sweet-sounding voice called to me as a young, beautiful woman with long dark hair stepped up beside me. "I'm sorry, I don't smoke." She looked at me and smiled, slipping her cigarette back into the pack. That's okay. You wouldn't happen to have the time, would you? I've been waiting on this cab forever." I gave her the time, and we stood there making small talk for a while till the cab finally arrived. We agreed to split the fare and hopped in. Something about her made me happy. Maybe it was her energy or possibly that wicked little smirk, but I wanted to know her. We exchanged numbers before I got to my stop and went our separate ways. The next night I went out again. I roamed around, driving from spot to spot, hoping to catch the urge, but this time it didn't take long. I was passing through Uptown when I spotted him. Your run-of-the-mill neighborhood tough guy standing on the corner, talking to a lady that was clearly uninterested in the conversation. I parked on the other end of the building, then got out and crept through the alley, coming out behind him. I decided to use a gun this time. I watched from the shadows, waiting for the chance. There's nothing like that feeling when you're waiting for someone to step into your trap. I love it, almost as much as the fallout. He walked past the alley, not knowing I was there. I stepped out behind him, silently raised the gun, aimed it at the back of his head, and fired. It was over in an instant, and I was racing through the alley back to my car. When I got there, I calmly got in and drove away as people started to gather around the body. No one saw me. It happened so fast, no one had a clue. Thanks to the revolver, there was no shells to be found. It was quick and clean. I had another 2 days left on my vacation, and I was going to make the most of it. I wanted to do something special this time. I traveled to an upscale shopping center, wandered around buying little things while fishing for another fix. A gray-haired older woman sat on a bench near the shoe store, talking to someone on the phone. Perfect. I walked over and sat on the bench next to her. In my left pocket, I was holding a syringe filled with paint thinner. I intentionally bumped her with my leg and injected her with a full dose, then excused myself and walked away. I didn't wait to see the outcome, but I found out later through the news that the woman died. With 2 down, I was feeling like a kid again. And on my last day of my vacation, I decided that was exactly what I wanted. But before I go further, I just want it to be known, I'm not a sexual predator. I haven't ever and will never rape anyone. As a point of pride, I go out of my way to eliminate those types when I come across them, but I'll save that for later. In any case, I drove to the other side of the city for my last day and spent it looking for a victim. It took hours to finally find a good fishing hole, but when I did, it took less than 15 minutes to find what I was looking for. He was just a little younger than I was around the time of my first kill. He'd wandered away from the playground and was off playing by himself. The park sits on the edge of the natural bayou. The water's deep and dark. It's separated from the playground by a dense section of trees, which is where I had been watching from the entire time. I didn't hesitate. The moment he was out of view from the playground, I rushed him. I snapped his neck before he could scream, then weighed down the body with rocks and dumped him in the water. My vacation was over. On Monday morning, I stepped through those doors, still riding the buzz off the last week of my life, and it felt so amazing. I breezed through the day and even managed to log some programming time before I clocked out and headed home. I was feeling so good I finally decided to make a call I should have made days ago. Her name was Tabitha. Since the day I met her, I couldn't stop thinking about her. Even when I was getting my fix, her name rattled around my brain every day. I actually felt nervous waiting for her to pick up. I couldn't believe it. I was in the middle of rehearsing what I would say when the line clicked over. Hello? That one little word set my nerves at ease. Smiling to myself, I cleared my throat and the words just seemed to spill out. We talked for hours about everything and nothing, laughing and connecting on the things we had in common. It was the most joy I'd ever felt from a stranger in my life. We took it slow, only talking on the phone for weeks before finally seeing each other in person. The energy didn't change. It was still so comfortable and natural with her that it felt like we had always known one another. One date led to another and another, but the odd thing was, I didn't feel that urge anymore. Weeks passed. Hell, months passed. And we had become a legit couple. And in that entire time, I didn't kill a single person. Then, on a Wednesday evening, it came back. I don't know what triggered it. I was having a good day, but as I pulled up to a stoplight on the way home, I turned and looked at the car next to me. The guy behind the wheel looked young. He was nodding his head to some song on the radio. I took the gun out from under my seat, then motioned for him to roll his window down, keeping it aside. When he let it down, I brought the gun up and fired as the light turned green and drove off. When I got home, I disassembled the gun and put my bike in the car. That night, I drove out to the bog burying the pieces of the gun along the way. When I got there, I cleaned out the car before torching it and rode it into the swamp. It was a long ride home. I didn't make it back till morning. When I got there, I reported my car stolen and I went on with my day. I'd been jogging past Caleb's body for a few days, and there was no smell. I watch the news almost religiously. There hasn't been a word about a body being found. I was starting to second guess myself. Was he really dead? He had to be, but I needed to know for sure. That night when I got home from work, I went for a walk. Most people avoid the trails after sundown, so I was sure no one would be there. I strode along calmly till I got to the spot. Moving quickly, I darted off the path and went straight to where his body should have been. It was gone. Standing there in the dark, staring at the dirt, I was confused. How was this possible? I was running all through the scenarios in my head when I heard her voice. Hey, babe. I turned around to see Tabitha standing there in a black tracksuit with her hood pulled up. She smiled and stepped towards me, looking around with a cute little smirk on her face. Oh, what are you doing out here? I didn't know what to say. For the first time in my life, I was scared of being caught. I actually stumbled through my words, a little trying to give myself away. Nothing. I just stepped off the trail to take a piss. What are you doing here? She smiled, pulling her hood back up and stepping a little closer. Taking a piss, Are you sure? You don't seem to be in much of a hurry. I thought you might be looking for your friend Caleb. My jaw nearly dropped as she moved closer and kissed me, then whispered, He's gone. But I've got a little surprise for you. Pulling a small box from her pocket, she kissed me again, then handed it to me. I don't know what I was expecting, but this definitely wasn't it. Still smiling at me, Tabitha stepped back, telling me to open the box. So I did. Inside was something that blew my mind. It was small, perfectly shaped square of human skin. Oh, what the fuck is this? I didn't mean to sound ungrateful, but I was still shocked by what was happening. Tabitha's smile changed to a slightly disappointed look as she stepped back. Well, I thought you might like a little keepsake. I always keep a memento of my kills, so I thought maybe you would like something to remember your friend by. Don't worry, no one's going to find him. I cremated the body. You're not mad, are you? I couldn't be upset. Looking at her in the moonlight, I felt something strange, a slight fluttering in my stomach and warm, fuzzy feeling in my brain. I smiled and hugged her, and then said those 3 little words that I'd never understood before that moment. I love you. Now, I know it's strange hearing someone like me saying those words, and believe me, I was just as surprised as you are. I'd never said that to anyone, let alone actually meant it. But there it was. Tabitha threw her arms around me, hugging me tight, and then gave me that look and said, "Let's go home." From that night on, we were inseparable. I didn't think it could get any better, but it did. It turns out fishing is a whole lot easier when you have bait. Our first official kill as a couple happened a week after we moved in together. Normally, I plan things out to some extent. Tabitha, on the other hand, was more of a in-the-moment type. We were out at the club one night, having a few drinks. When it comes to liquor, I'm a lightweight. Shot a Jack with a beer back, and I'm pretty much done drinking for the night. On this night in particular, I was pushing it a little. I was on my 3rd beer when I excused myself to the restroom. When I came back, Tabitha was at the bar. There was some random guy hitting on her. I'm not the possessive type. Things like that don't bother me. I paused for a second just watching, and she noticed. She shot me that evil little grin, and somehow I just knew what it meant. I fell back, keeping my distance, watching from across the club. After about 20 minutes, she sent me a text. It was time. Getting up from my table and making my way outside and taking out my phone, I stood off to the side of the door pretending to be talking to someone till they came out. They laughed and talked as they strode towards the parking lot. When they turned the corner, I got moving. The guy pulled out his keys, hitting his alarm as they made it closer to the car he was driving. Getting low, I slipped into the shadows quickly, moving through the lot till I was just a car away. I quietly removed my belt, then snuck around to the trunk of the car to get a look. His back was to me while he continued chatting her up. He never saw me coming. Moving in fast, I slipped the belt around his neck and snatched him to the ground, then dropped my knee on his face and pulled till he started squirming. Tabitha grabbed his keys, popped the trunk, and then helped me toss him in. Since we had taken a cab to the club, taking his car worked out perfectly. I drove us back to our new place so Tabby could get her car. Then we drove out to the middle of nowhere and got rid of the body. Full disclosure here, I technically tend to stray away from making a mess. It's just easier in my opinion. Tabby felt differently about it. For her, it was art. I have to admit, watching her work was impressive. She started by having me help her lay the body out spread eagle. Once she'd used scissors to cut away his clothing, she pulled a scalpel from her little black bag and proceeded to flay every inch of skin from his body, leaving nothing but exposed muscle. She moved with grace and precision I couldn't imagine. It was the most humbling moment I'd ever experienced. Once the skin was removed, she took her time dissecting the body, burying each piece individually. We were out there all night, but when it was done, you couldn't tell that we'd been out there. Once she got cleaned up, we tossed her bloody rags in his car and torched it, and then got out of there. She laid her seat back and slept the whole way home. Every once in a while, I would glance over at her and smile. The morning sun gave her a glow. That day, we shared everything. She had been hunting since college. Her first kill was one of her sorority sisters, and from there she couldn't stop. She didn't go out as often anymore because of her process took a lot out of her. But since with me, she'd gotten back active. It was amazing. I couldn't believe we were so connected. We started going out once a week. It got to the point we'd hit every part of the city at least once, and after months, we made a mistake. It was a small thing, really. Neither of us saw it coming, but we probably should have. A body turned up 2 blocks from the school near downtown. We'd covered our tracks, but someone saw us. It was bound to happen sooner or later. To our credit, they couldn't give an exact description. All the witnesses could say that they'd seen 2 people dressed in black dump the body. It was time for a break. Over the next few weeks, more and more bodies turned up. They started linking disappearances to the killings. The media hadn't given us an official name, but I knew it would happen soon. Together, we had 9 bodies, not including Caleb, tied in the ones I'd done since meeting her. It was 14. Add in her numbers, and we were at 17 and counting. As the days rolled by, I was having trouble staying focused at work. I was feeling off since having to lay low was getting to me. Most days I was quick-tempered and agitated. I found myself getting into confrontations. I couldn't take it anymore. I was riding the bus home after work one evening because Tabby couldn't pick me up. I wasn't really planning on killing anyone, but as the bus rattled and bounced along, I spotted someone waiting at the next stop. He was an older guy, late 50s, I'd guess. He wasn't in the best shape, and there was nothing particularly stand out about him. His clothes were old but well kept. He seemed clean, and when he got on the bus, he spoke to the driver with a friendly tone. Nevertheless, I chose him. Since I wasn't carrying a weapon, I thought I'd improvise when the time came. The old man rang the bell, and I pretended as if it were my stop as well. Once we were both on the sidewalk, I turned and walked away from him, using his reflection in the windows across the street to keep track of his movements. When he entered a bookstore a few doors down, I stopped. The old guy must have been in there for an hour. While I was waiting, Tabby called. "Hey babe, I was just calling to let you know that I was going to be a little late getting home. I ran into an old friend from school, and we were going to do a little catching up." I laughed to myself. I could hear muffled whines in the background. I knew she was lying, but it saved me from having to make up something. I told her it was okay, and I would see her when she got home. Then I got off the phone. When I hung up, I turned to see the old man walking out of the store. He strolled along, keeping a good pace till he came to an old apartment complex. I nearly lost track of him a couple times before we made it to his place. I couldn't go through the front door without being seen. I needed a way in. Making my way to the back of his building, I hoped there would be a fire escape. There wasn't. His apartment was on the 3rd floor. It wasn't much of a climb, but it was risky. Using the downspout from the gutter, I inched my way up till I was right next to his window and peeked inside. I could hear him talking, but I couldn't see him. It sounded like he may have been talking to a pet. Reaching out, I tried to open the window, and to my surprise, it wasn't locked. It took some effort, but I was able to slip inside without him noticing. I listened to him while I looked for something I could use. I was in his bedroom. The place reeked of urine and old food. It was nauseating. After silently searching for a moment, I found an old steak knife sitting on a plate of molded leftovers under the bed. Slowly making my way out of the bedroom, I could still hear his voice. "Calm down, girl. Calm down, I know it's uncomfortable. Easy, easy. Don't fight it. Relax. Yes, that's a good girl. Something about the way he was talking didn't feel right. The more I listened, the more I was sure he wasn't talking to an animal. Easing up to the end of the hall, I found out just how right I was. I stuck a look just as the old man set a syringe on the table next to him. I couldn't understand what I was seeing at first. From my point of view, all I could see was the back of a recliner and the old man stepping over to a bookshelf. I didn't see anyone else in the room, and I didn't see any animals. It was now or never. I rushed in, and in my haste, I stepped on something that crunched loudly, causing him to turn around and face me. "You picked the wrong apartment, boy." His voice wasn't pleasant like it was on the bus. Now he sounded rough and angry. I'd underestimated him. A mistake, to say the least. I hadn't had a chance to see who he was talking to yet. He charged, tackling me to the ground, punching me in the ribs as soon as we landed. He was a lot stronger than he looked. We wrestled around on the floor with him snarling into my ear. "I've been looking for a new pet." I did my best to get free. During the struggle, I managed to grab a metal pet food bowl and slam it into the side of his head, buying me a second to scramble to my feet. That's when I saw who he was talking to. There was a naked woman unconscious in the recliner. There were strange symbols carved all over her body. Some were healed while others still bled freely. She was emaciated, her hair was falling out, and her face had been painted to what looked like a cat. What the fuck? I didn't have time to focus on her. The old man was on his feet, grinning like a madman. Before I could move, he rushed in and cracked me across the jaw with a wicked right hand that made me stagger. I didn't get a chance to recover. He scooped me off to my feet, then slammed me down so hard I almost blacked out. While I was rolling around on the floor, gasping for air, the old bastard stood over me, dusting himself off. He was just about to spit out another shitty one-liner when I kicked him in the balls. The sound he made almost put a smile on my face. When he dropped, I got up and grabbed the syringe he had placed on the table and then pinned him down and jammed it in his neck. It took a lot to keep him down long enough for whatever that was going to kick in. When he finally went still, I took a breather. Once I got myself together, I tied him up and started looking around. I couldn't just kill him and leave. I'd touched too many things in here. My prints would be everywhere. I found a few chemicals I could use to start a fire, then went around dousing everything I could. When I was done, I used a burner on the stove to light some paper and grabbed a towel and a bottle of glass cleaner. I had to leave the way I came in while wiping away every last of my prints. By the time I'd wiped down the window and climbed out, the flames were roaring. Taking my time, I covered the last of my tracks and walked home. I hadn't been out of the shower long when Tabby got in. She immediately hugged me and started telling me about her day. When she had got to the part about chopping up a coworker, she got a little nervous. I laughed and told her what I'd been through. She thought it was hilarious. We had a great night after that. The next morning was a completely different story. Both murders were all over the news. 3 bodies were discovered in that apartment after the fire I set burnt down half the building. The body Tabby left was found by some local kids on their way to school. On the upside, we'd done them separately, so no one could say that they'd seen us together. On the downside, the city was already buzzing from the other murders. This was going to take us off the streets for a long time. The first few weeks were actually pretty nice. Tabby and I would still go out, but we wouldn't bother anyone. We would go places, make up scenarios just to pass time, but after a month, we started getting a little wound up. It was summer at this point. We both had some vacation time saved up from our jobs, so we decided to take a trip. We spent a week in Rio, and it was amazing. The nightlife there was unbelievable. I'm not going to tell you what went down there, but I will say we definitely have to go back. When we got home, I was a little disappointed. Someone else was all over the news. There had been 2 new murders during this time we were gone, but these were different. The victims were known criminals, but had been kidnapped and tortured before being killed. I didn't think much of it until I saw the victim's picture. I knew one of them. He was the guy I bought my guns from. Tabby tried convincing me that it was just a coincidence, but something about it didn't feel right. The two victims looked very similar, around the same height and build, both bald-headed with dark beards. Now, true enough, there was no telling how many enemies this guy had, but I couldn't get it off my mind. Over the next few days, things slowly got back to normal. It was still incredibly hard not to hit the streets, but I was doing okay with it. Tabby was doing better than I was on that front. She was calm, cool, collected as usual. She didn't have a care in the world till a medical supply store was robbed. The thieves didn't take money. They took surgical equipment, receipt books, and the hard drives from the computers. The computers are what got her attention. She'd been buying her toys at that store for months. She always paid cash, but she would certainly be on security footage. We were both completely paranoid over the next few days. The anxiety of it wasn't something either of us had prepared for. We were arguing over little details, starting to get stirred crazy from not being able to hunt. We'd had enough. Loading up our gear, we drove 2 hours outside the city and snatched a victim. It felt so good to get it all out. We kept her alive for hours, and by the time it was over, there wasn't much left. We calmed down after that, and things got back to normal. Then a month later, early on a Sunday morning, Tabby came into the kitchen and said, "I'm pregnant." It's strange. I never once thought about having children. Not that I had anything against them. I just didn't put any thought into the subject. It didn't seem real until we went to our first doctor's visit, and I saw the ultrasound. Tabby was so excited she could barely sit still, while I felt like someone had just clubbed me over the head. When they said there were 2 heartbeats, I nearly passed out. We were having twins. For the first few days after getting the news, I was in shock. I drifted through my days on autopilot, lost in my own thoughts. By the end of the first week, it was sinking in. At this point, we hadn't been active for a while. Well, not in the city, at least. We were still headline news, but there were these odd events that just kept popping up. The one that really set up a red flag was a home invasion that happened to take place at my old apartment. The new tenant said nothing was taken, but the place had been ransacked. That by itself wouldn't have bothered me. It wasn't the best neighborhood. But when they reported a second similar event at Tabby's old place, I stopped in my tracks. I didn't want to worry her about this, but I needed to know who was looking for us. I should have known she wouldn't let that happen. Before I could begin to come up with a plan, she was coming to me to talk about it. Before you fly off the handle, I know this looks bad. We've got a real problem right now, and if we don't do something about it soon, it's going to be landing at our doorstep. We need to clean the house, make sure there's nothing and no one who could possibly be an issue. Like it or not, we're done. We have to stop. When this is over, we can go back to how it was. We have to think about the children. They're our legacy. If we don't make it, they don't make it. The idea of never killing again didn't sit right with me. I wanted to argue, but I knew better. And she was right, the children came first. We sat and made a list of bodies that hadn't been discovered and people we used for supplies or help. There were 4 bodies and 2 connections. It was a short list, but it wasn't going to be easy. So I chose to get rid of the links first. Number 1 on the list was a woman named Caroline Wilson. I bought my poisons from her because she was a certified chemist. You wouldn't believe the stuff she came up with. I hated having to get rid of her for obvious reasons, but she had to go. I set up a meeting through our usual channels and we agreed to a public exchange. The plan was simple. While I was having dinner with Caroline, Tabby would stow away in the back seat of her car, ambush her when she left. I knew Tabby would put her own spin on it, but I wasn't expecting a spectacle. Caroline and I exchanged goods and ordered as usual. In the typical fashion, halfway through the meal, she called for the check, paid, and left. By the time I finished eating, Tabby was done. She had decapitated Caroline and put her head in the trunk of her own car. A little overdramatic if you ask me, but to each his own, or in this case, her own. Tabby set up the second person on the list. His name was Matthias Burke. He ran the crematorium she'd used to get rid of Caleb's body, saying as this was supposed to be my last kill, I wanted to make it look special. Now, I've seen my fair share of strange shit, but Matt took the cake. Turned out, he liked his women old and cold, if you get where I'm going with that. He was a necrophiliac. Tabby caught him in the act, and that's how she was able to blackmail him into helping her. Lucky for me, I didn't have to see any of that when I went in. I found him cleaning out the oven. He was probably the easiest kill I'd ever had. All I had to do was close the door and turn it on. There's nothing particularly fantastic about it, but watching someone burn to death was definitely entertaining. Moving the bodies turned out to be a lot more complicated than it should have. Tabby chose to sit this one out. She'd been feeling so drained all she could do was sleep. I didn't mind handling it without her. Truthfully, I enjoyed the peace and quiet. The smell, on the other hand, not so much. Digging up liquefied remains is not something I want to do again. The first body was the worst because it was the oldest of the four. The second was in a warehouse on the outskirts of town. It wasn't much better, but at least it was still in one piece. The third is where I ran into trouble. She was a cheerleader from a local high school. We'd buried parts of her in bags of lye under the bleachers around the football field. I hadn't been there long, since she was already bagged. All I had to do was dig her up, toss the pieces into my duffel, and get out of there. I was on the second arm when I started getting an odd feeling. I like to think my instincts are pretty good, so when I got that vibe, I instantly stopped digging and started looking around. The football field sits behind the school. I wasn't visible from the street, so if there was anyone watching, they were either in the building or in the woods that bordered the rear of the property. When I couldn't spot anyone, I went on gathering up all the parts. I just put the last of it in my bag when he let himself be known. I don't know who this guy was, but he came out blasting. The first shot zipped past my ear, impacting the frame of the bleachers. I never got a good look at him. I was too busy dodging the barrage of bullets he was launching in my direction and trying not to lose the bag. I faked a quick right, then darted to my left, sprinting through an open between the sets of bleachers, just as another round flew by. The moment I was in the open, I turned, bolting out for the exit gates. I'd just leapfrogged the first turnstile when a shot hit me in the left shoulder, throwing me off balance. I had to plant my right hand on the ground to keep from falling. Struggling to get myself upright, I raced through the gates and across the parking lot. The SUV I was driving was parked 2 blocks away. If I could make it there, I was home free. I could already hear sirens in the distance. Whoever this guy was, we were both running out of time. I don't know if I'd lost him or if he took off to avoid the cops, but I was glad he was off my ass, and I was able to get out of there. By the time I was able to get rid of the body and dump the car back in the long-term parking at the airport, I was exhausted. Luckily for me, that bullet didn't hit me square. It glanced off the bone and took some flesh with it, but it didn't seem to bleed all that much. And Tabby was able to stitch me up with no problem. That didn't stop her from asking a million questions I had no answer for. What do you mean someone ambushed you? Who was it? Did they say anything? Or did they just attack? I need every detail. We have to take care of this before things get any worse. I went over every second of it, at least 3 times, and we were no closer to figuring out who this guy was or how he was able to track us down. My first thought was he might have been a cop, but it just didn't seem like that was the case. Admittedly, I don't have a lot of experience with police. I've never been arrested, and my dealings with them were limited to tickets and the occasional run-in with an off-duty officer working security. Tabby didn't have much insight on the situation either, so we were left jumping to conclusions. I wanted to chalk the whole thing up to a family member of one of our victims, but even if that were true, this guy was clearly well versed with using firearms. Normal people don't move the way this guy moved. I never saw him coming, and that itself worried me. We need to start thinking about getting out of the city. There's nothing keeping us here. My job will let me transfer to another office, but I know your job is local, so you won't be able to work for a while. That was going to happen sooner or later anyway with you being pregnant. Leaving could be our best move. The only other choice is to track this guy down and get rid of him before he finds us. What do you want to do? Tabby sat there for a moment, rolling over her options. She smiled at me and got up from the couch, heading for the kitchen. She came back carrying one of those leather bank bags stuffed with money, setting it down on the coffee table. She gave me that "please don't be mad at me" look and sat next to me. I was going to surprise you with this for your birthday. I've been putting away all the money from our date nights. There's $20,000 in this bag. It's enough to keep us on the move for a while. With the way things are going, we're going to have to leave anyway. I say, let's just go. I had to smile. She was always one step ahead of me. We were in the middle of making plans when it hit me. We couldn't just pack up and leave. We had to vanish. I stopped Tabby from packing and set her down. I've got an idea. No matter how good we are, we had to have left a trail. This guy can find it so the police can find it. The trail has to end somewhere, so why not here? We go out one last time and find two people that look something like us. We bring them here. We kill them. We set the building on fire. We take them to an ATM first and have them empty out their bank accounts, making it look like we were about to run. After that, bring them here, stage a fight, and then kill them both and torch the place. With a little tweaking of her own, Tabby agreed that it was the best play. She added us going by the doctor's office on the way out to destroy her files and cover up anything about the children. It was perfect. It took close to a week to find our doubles and put the plan in motion. Tracking down Tabby's double felt strange to me. It was uncanny how similar they were. When I saw them side by side, I had to do a double take. My double, on the other hand, I felt like he could have been better. It didn't matter. The plan went off without a hitch. It wasn't long before we were sitting on the top floor of the parking garage a few blocks away, watching the place burn. As we were there, we were sure the fire department wouldn't get there in time. We drove off. There was one last stop we had to make, then we were gone. It wasn't supposed to take long. We'd gone to a small private practice, so there wasn't a lot to do. Tabby went in to wipe the hard drive and grab whatever paperwork there was. For some reason, it was taking her forever to come out. I was starting to get restless, waiting out in the car, thinking something had to have gone wrong. I was about to get out, and that's when I saw her come running around the corner, heard gunshots as she screamed, "Start the car, start the car." Cranking the engine and grabbing my pistol from under the seat, I stepped out and fired towards the building till Tabby made it to the car. I didn't see who I was shooting at until she was in, and even then I just got a glimpse of a dark figure near the edge of the building. Getting in and throwing it in reverse, we sped through the lot with more shots being fired. Yanking the hard ride, I spun the car, threw it in drive, and hauled ass out of there with the lights off till we were just a few blocks away. What the fuck was that? Are you alright? Was that him? Was that the guy? Did you even get a look at him? Tabby didn't respond. She just kept looking out the rear window, making sure we weren't being followed. When she was sure there was no one behind us, she let out a sigh of relief and sat back in her seat. I'm okay. No, I didn't get a look at him. He came out of nowhere. I was on my way to you when he started shooting. I never even saw where he was coming from. We drove all night, and the next day, only stopping for gas or to switch drivers. We finally came off the road a little town called Eagle Mountain. We got to a room and a local bed and breakfast and tried to sort out our next move. I was watching the news as usual, waiting to hear about the fire when a breaking story cut in. Guests at a hotel complained about their tap water having a bad odor and taste. The last 4 bodies were supposed to be moving had been discovered in the water tank of the hotel roof. Oh well, a little bubonic plague never hurt anybody, Tabby joked, still drying off from her shower. I couldn't take my eyes off her. My attention left the screen while I watched her standing in the mirror combing her hair. Then I heard our names as our pictures appeared on the screen. Tragic news from uptown this morning. The bodies of Dante Coleman and Tabitha Powell were found in the charred remains of their apartment after a building fire destroyed most of the complex. We'll have more on the story later this evening at 5. I turned off the television and smiled. We had done it. The world thought we were dead. All we needed to do now was get the guy that was following us out of the way, and we could get back to our lives.